Greetings. My name is Jessica Hayden, Chairperson of Discipleship Council. We are grateful for the energy and faithfulness of our ministry team that allowed us to have an impactful year. As all of us have learned during the dual pandemics, rooting ourselves in purpose and mission is essential, both in the local church and the conference, as we all made necessary pivots. As we began our ministry year, we centered our work around the mission and vision of the annual conference. The Baltimore-Washington Conference inspires and equips local faith communities to develop disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, so that more transformed lives transform lives. Deepening discipleship is at the heart of everything we do. Leader development, new faith expressions, young people's ministry, advocacy and action, and wellness and missions all undergird this. This centering work is important for us so that we can fulfill our responsibility to ensure that conference resources align to its vision, mission, and critical issues as we discern, develop, review, and evaluate the strategic direction of the conference toward its vision and goals. One of our primary goals for the year, pre-COVID, was to identify, develop, and implement meaningful shared metrics regarding conference ministry effectiveness. We began a multi-pronged approach to discern the most meaningful ways to measure the number of people who are engaged and maturing in Wesleyan discipleship, as well as the impact being made in communities in which our churches and our ministries reside. We began with discussing what effective metrics would include. We responded to the question, how do we know world-transforming discipleship making is working? Or how do we determine ministry effectiveness? We know it's working when there are new connections occurring within the church and the community. This includes new relationships, new participations, new pathways to discipleship. We know it's working when there's a synergy. This includes ministries that are replicable and sustainable and have a healthy balance between input and output. When ministries are connected to maturing in Wesleyan discipleship, this relates to the ministry's why, and when they lead to transformative experiences. And as a reminder, here is the Wesleyan discipleship that we are reclaiming. As United Methodists, we unite as disciples engaged in witnessing to Jesus Christ in the world and following his teachings through acts of compassion, justice, worship, and devotion under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. This is rooted in the Great Commandment as we seek to increase our love of God through acts of devotion and worship, and increase in our love of neighbor through acts of compassion and justice, both personally and communally. Our action and participation is required in order for this not to be a theoretical exercise. As you and I follow Jesus through engaging in acts of devotion, worship, compassion, and justice under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, we grow as well-rounded disciples. And the words that surround this Wesleyan rule of discipleship are the means of grace. John Wesley taught that God's grace is unearned and that we are not to be idle waiting to experience grace. We are to engage in the means of grace. Now, this is not an exhaustive list or a list of to-dos. The means of grace are ways God works invisibly in disciples, hastening, strengthening, and confirming faith so that God's grace pervades in and through disciples. Amidst this pandemic, we are learning that practicing the means of grace is not dependent upon our ability to gather for in-person worship. Virtual spaces have become spaces for worship, prayer, and studying of scriptures. Ministries of compassion continue to occur as individuals and churches respond to the physical, social, and spiritual needs of their neighbors. We have also witnessed the reclaiming of the discipline of justice as individuals and churches have led and participated in marches and protests that call out the sin of racism and work to dismantle it. We continue to reclaim our Wesleyan discipleship even as we respond to the changing ministry and social landscape. During the 2019 church conference season, we began gathering data about pathways to maturing disciples through additional questions in the pastor's reports. Pastors were asked to respond to questions about their church's engagement in justice and specifically the Northeastern jurisdiction call to action on racial justice. Pastors were also asked to respond to questions regarding their congregation's process for intentional discipleship and how they measure impact. And as we reviewed the data gathered from those reports, we celebrate the fact that more than 1/3 of pastors reported concrete congregational engagement with the NEJ call to action. 60% of our congregations practice acts of justice, not just compassionate service, as a part of their communal spiritual disciplines. Now, the reason that this adds up to more than 100% is that some written answers described multiple categories. We are also celebrating the number of people that are reporting congregations are talking about implementing an intentional discipleship process. 213 congregations are there, or are working on implementing an intentional discipleship process. That's 182 of our congregations, or have identified themselves as being able to serve as a teaching congregation to develop and use an intentional discipleship process. 47 churches are here. We celebrate this information as it affirms for us that in the midst of uncertain and challenging times, which at that point of time involved denominational stress, our congregations within this annual conference are remaining focused on one of the core tenets of our faith, discipleship. We also celebrate that congregations are open to learning how to measure impact better, and that many recognize that participation numbers don't tell the whole story and sometimes are inadequate. All of the data gathered from the pastors' reports and from the discipleship board reports inform our approach to the 2020 goals. Our first goal is that we will continue to measure progress on board goals, which are essential to the mission of inspiring and equipping local faith communities to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Secondly, we will continue to support the NEJ Call to Action goals. The Baltimore-Washington Conference's approach to the NEJ Call to Action is rooted in building relationships and creating a culture that allows all persons and cultures to feel safe in having bold conversations and confronting racism. Embeds cultural competency and anti-bias work throughout the BWC's existing networks, trainings, and gatherings, uplifts what is happening at the grassroots levels, and invites faith communities to engage in conversations and experiences that help them take the next faithful step toward becoming racial justice change agents. Optimizes existing opportunities to include training and conversations, and incorporates better assessment and accountability into our systems so that racism is dismantled and multiculturalism enabled. We have been making reports on progress annually to the Northeastern jurisdiction's Vision Table, the Multi-Ethnic Center, and the Episcopacy Committee, and we have posted those on our NEJ Call to Action webpage. As a continuation of the NEJ Call to Action for Racial Justice, the Discipleship Council developed a commitment to becoming an anti-racist church invitation. Being anti-racist is believing that racism is everyone's problem and understanding that we all have a role in stopping it. That being said, being anti-racist is a different journey for white people than for Black people and other people of color. No one is born racist or anti-racist. These result from the choices we make. Making a commitment to become anti-racist is rooted in our Christian discipleship, as we see embodied in the person and ministry of Jesus Christ, who proclaimed good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and that the oppressed be freed. As Christ followers, we must choose to be anti-racist, both individually and collectively. And as we commit to transform our lives, our churches, and our society, we acknowledge we each enter this work in different places. Just as the process of intentional discipleship will develop contextually based on the culture, dynamics, and needs within each local church, a pathway toward becoming an anti-racist church is also a contextual process that involves meeting people where they are and providing them the resources, grace, and accountability to take the next faithful step toward becoming an anti-racist, both individually and collectively. The expectation is not that a pathway toward becoming an anti-racist church looks the same among congregations. Instead, the expectation is that congregations within the BWC would make a commitment to be on a path. The commitment to becoming an anti-racist church offers a shared framework. And we celebrate the more than 300 disciples and 144 churches and church-related institutions within the BWC who have already indicated that they are on this pathway. Working together, we strive to achieve the following goals. Increase by at least 10% per year the number of churches who are on a pathway to becoming an anti-racist church so that by 2022, all of our BWC churches are on a path toward becoming racial justice change agents. That each local church reports on its progress as related to the NEJ call to action on racial justice and on its internal and external conversations annually at their church or church conference, with 10% more churches engaged than the year before, so that by 2026, 100% of our churches are doing the work to grow in our intercultural competency covenant throughout the conference. Therefore, we invite you to pray about how God is calling you and your church to be engaged in dismantling racism, not for a moment, but for a lifetime. As a continuation of the NEJ call to action for racial justice, we are asking individuals and churches to pledge their commitment to becoming an anti-racist church by signing their name to the document that may be found on the conference's racial justice resource page at bwcumc.org/justice now. There are two frequently asked questions by those that are considering signing the commitment. Are individuals or churches supposed to sign? And what happens once we do? Whether you are one person who is working to move your church toward becoming an anti-racist church, or if your church leadership or church as a whole has made the commitment, we're asking that you please sign the form. Your digital signature, along with your church's name, city, and state, will become a part of this movement to make different choices about how you are participating in the dismantling of racism. All BWC congregations will be asked to report on progress on the NEJ call to action at their church conference in the fall of 2020 and thereafter. And while all churches have access to our vast online resources located at bwcumc.org/justice now, only those churches who have made the commitment to do this sacred work will be given priority for consultation and cohort formation if desired. There are monthly check-ins for support, encouragement, resourcing, and more. Together, we will seek justice, do the work to end racism as disciples of Jesus Christ. Finally, our third 2020 goal is to continue crystallizing our system for understanding ministry vitality. We celebrate the effective ministry that is taking place within our local congregations before and in the midst of the pandemic. The more we learn about and understand the forms of ministry that are most effective in our varying contexts, the more lives are transformed. The BWC represents diverse and vibrant expression of God's kingdom, and there is no one-size-fits-all model for effective ministry. We want to know what is working well and where pastors or congregations need support so that we can share in the work of making disciples for Jesus Christ. One next step will occur this fall during the Church Conference season. This year's church profile includes elements from last year's pastor's report and are directly related to the Discipleship Council's work. Specifically, churches will be invited to provide information on how church members are engaged in Wesleyan discipleship through rating their participation in witness, in compassion, in justice, in worship, and devotion, in defining the current state of the congregation's discipleship process, in describing the congregation's current level of vitality, in identifying where the congregation is on the pathway of becoming an anti-racist church. As we continue to develop and refine this system of understanding, we will strengthen our ability to inspire and equip local faith communities to better develop disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world so that more transformed lives transform lives.